across the spiraling arms of civilized space, where 1,000 species had learned to coexist through careful diplomacy and even more careful distance. There existed certain universal truths. Mathematics worked the same everywhere. Physics didn't care about your number of limbs. And every sentient species, according to YouTube analytics, 98% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. Without exception, maintained a healthy respect for the creatures that could eat them. The Vidian Institute of Xenobiological Studies occupied a prestigious position on Nexus Station 7, a neutral ground where young minds from across the stars gathered to expand their understanding of life's infinite varieties. The station itself hung in the darkness like a metal flower, its petals rotating gently to provide the illusion of gravity for those species unfortunate enough to require it. Inside its climate-controlled corridors, the temperature never varied beyond comfortable ranges. The lighting never shifted to uncomfortable spectrums, and absolutely nothing ever tried to bite anyone, which made it, by most standards, the perfect place to study predators. Professor Krelnak, a distinguished Throssian whose scaled hide bore the deep purple of academic achievement, had taught predatory biology 301 for 17 cycles. In that time, he had observed patterns. Students from herbivore species approached the subject with intellectual curiosity, tempered by ancestral dread. Students from omnivore backgrounds treated it as a fascinating puzzle. And students from predator species themselves displayed that peculiar mixture of pride and defensiveness that came from being studied rather than studying. The semester's major assignment had been announced 3 weeks prior, and it was beautifully simple in concept. Present a comprehensive analysis of an apex predator from any known world, detailing its hunting strategies, ecological impact, and evolutionary advantages. Standard academic fare. The kind of project that resulted in polished presentations, carefully researched data, and absolutely zero chance of anyone getting mauled. The classroom itself reflected the Institute's commitment to safety and scholarship. Holographic projectors lined the walls, capable of rendering any creature in perfect detail without the messy complications of, say, actual creatures. Climate controls could simulate environments from Arctic tundra to volcanic plains. Emergency force fields could deploy in 0.3 seconds, though in 17 years of teaching, Krelnak had never needed them. Students sat in ergonomically appropriate seating arranged in a semicircle, their various appendages folded, coiled, or positioned according to species-specific comfort. 3 weeks had given them ample time to choose their subjects, conduct their research, and prepare presentations that would, Krelnak hoped, demonstrate some originality. He had already reviewed the preliminary proposals. Tekesa, the Vrin student with compound eyes that reflected worry at all times, had chosen the ice stalkers of her homeworld, predictably safe predators that hunted in packs but posed no threat to anything larger than a snow hare. Vormak, built like a boulder with comparable personality, had selected the plains runners of the grassland colonies, quick and efficient, but ultimately unimpressive. And then there was the human. Her proposal had been submitted exactly on time, which was itself unusual for a species with such a flexible relationship with deadlines. It had been concise to the point of brevity. Apex predator analysis, Earth origin specimen, live demonstration preferred. Krelnak had approved it with minor reservations, assuming live demonstration meant sophisticated holographic modeling or perhaps some recorded footage. Humans, he had learned over the past semester, possessed excellent video documentation of practically everything, including things that absolutely should not have been documented. She sat in the third row now, during the class before presentation day, looking remarkably unconcerned while other students radiated various species-specific signals of stress. Humans were fascinating subjects for nonverbal communication studies, primarily because they insisted they were terrible at it, while simultaneously broadcasting their emotional states through dozens of subtle cues. This particular human displayed what Krelnak had learned to recognize as her planning something expression, where the corners of her mouth quirked upward, and her eyes held that peculiar gleam that preceded either brilliance or disaster. Sometimes both. "The presentation schedule has been finalized," Krelnak announced, his translator rendering his clicks and whistles into flat Galactic standard. "You will present in the order submitted. Tekesa begins at first bell tomorrow, followed by Vormak, then Jesseth, then our human colleague." A ripple of antenna twitching and tail flicking moved through the assembled students. Tomorrow would determine a significant portion of their final grades. More importantly, it would demonstrate whether they had absorbed anything beyond textbook definitions and safe theoretical frameworks. Tekesa's antennae drooped with resignation. Going first meant setting the standard, which was either an opportunity for glory or a guarantee of being forgotten by the time better presentations came along. Vormak remained stoic, which was his natural state and possibly the only expression his species possessed. Jesseth, a flowing mass of bioluminescent tentacles, pulsed with colors that translated roughly to moderate anxiety with undertones of preparation. The human raised her hand. "Yes?" Krelnak's third eyelid flickered with curiosity. "Would it be possible to present last instead? I'm experiencing some transportation complications with my specimen." Transportation complications. The phrase hung in the air like a suspicious odor. In Krelnak's experience, transportation complications meant either equipment failure or poor planning, neither of which boded well for presentation quality. "Your specimen is en route?" he asked, mentally preparing himself for whatever technological disaster might unfold. "More or less. It's a timing issue, really. Everything should be resolved by tomorrow afternoon." The professor's scales rippled in a pattern that expressed academic skepticism. Humans had a peculiar talent for understatement that made parsing their actual meaning an exercise in forensic linguistics. When they said, "should be resolved," they often meant, "might explode, but I'm optimistic." "Very well. You will present last. I trust this timing issue will not compromise the quality of your work?" Her smile widened fractionally. "I can guarantee it will be memorable." That was not the reassurance Krelnak had been seeking, but the class schedule was set. He dismissed the students with reminders to triple-check their presentation files and prepare for technical questions. As they filed out in their various modes of locomotion, the human lingered near the door, tapping something into her personal datapad with the focus of someone confirming complex arrangements. Krelnak had learned not to hover over students, but he permitted himself a moment of observation. Humans were relatively new to the galactic academic community, having only achieved faster-than-light travel 3 generations ago. They approached learning with enthusiasm that bordered on recklessness, asked questions that ranged from brilliant to bizarre, and had an unfortunate tendency to touch things clearly labeled, "Do not touch." But they were thorough researchers. He'd give them that. Tomorrow would reveal whether thoroughness translated to quality, or merely to creative disaster. Krelnak saved his lecture notes, secured the classroom systems, and departed for his office, where 17 years of teaching awards reminded him that he had survived worse than one human's presentation. Probably. The Institute's corridors hummed with the quiet efficiency of advanced civilization as he walked. Students clustered in study alcoves, reviewing notes in a dozen different languages. The cafeteria wafted smells from 50 worlds, all carefully filtered to avoid triggering anyone's predator-prey instincts. Somewhere in the recreation sector, a zero-gravity sports match was reaching its conclusion, judging by the multi-tonal cheering. Everything was ordered, safe, and thoroughly academic. Tomorrow morning would begin with Tekesa's presentation on ice stalkers, featuring detailed holographic reconstructions and carefully cited ecological studies. By afternoon, they would have covered 4 different predator species from 4 different worlds, all analyzed through the comfortable distance of screens and sensors and scholarly detachment. And then the human would present. Krelnak settled into his office chair, its adaptive surface conforming to his Throsian physiology, and pulled up the semester's roster on his wall. Display. The human's academic record scrolled past. Excellent marks in cellular biology, impressive work in comparative anatomy, a concerning enthusiasm for toxicology that had required additional safety briefings. Her attendance was perfect, her assignment completion exemplary, and her tendency to interpret suggested reading as mandatory deep dive had resulted in several discussions that exceeded the curriculum by significant margins. She was, by all objective measures, an outstanding student, which was precisely what made transportation complications so ominous. Krelnack's experience suggested that outstanding students, when combined with humans' particular brand of enthusiasm, occasionally produced results that were simultaneously academically brilliant and potentially catastrophic. He made a mental note to review the emergency protocols before tomorrow afternoon's presentations, just as a precautionary measure. After all, 17 years without deploying the emergency force fields was a streak he'd very much like to maintain. Outside his window, Nexus Station 7 continued its eternal rotation, stars wheeling past in their ancient patterns. Somewhere out there, in the vast darkness between worlds, the human's specimen was presumably experiencing transportation complications, whatever that actually meant. Tomorrow would provide answers. Krelnack saved his files, dimmed his office lights, and headed toward faculty quarters, his scales settling into the relaxed pattern of end-of-day contentment. Tomorrow would be fine. It would be just another day of presentations, academic discussion, and thoroughly safe predator analysis conducted through appropriate technological intermediaries. Behind him, unnoticed, the human's proposal file remained open on one screen, its final line visible in small text. Note: ethical approval for live specimen handling obtained from homeworld authorities. All safety protocols will be observed. Probably. That last word should have concerned him more than it did. Morning arrived on Nexus Station 7 the way it always did, through carefully calibrated lighting systems that mimicked natural sunrise for species that cared about such things. The Institute's corridors filled with students carrying datapads, projection equipment, and the nervous energy of impending evaluation. Professor Krelnack arrived early, as was his custom, and ran diagnostics on every system in the classroom. Holographic projectors, functional. Audio receivers, calibrated. Emergency force fields, armed and ready, though surely unnecessary. The classroom temperature held steady at the comfortable compromise of 22 degrees that offended no one while pleasing absolutely nobody. Tekessa entered first, her Vrin physiology practically vibrating with preparation anxiety. She had dressed formally, which for her species meant decorative carapace polish and ceremonial antenna rings. The presentation she loaded into the system was exhaustively researched, beautifully formatted, and catastrophically boring. "The Glacian Ice Stalker," she began, her translator rendering nervous clicking into equally nervous standard, "represents a model of efficient pack predation in sub-zero environments. Holographic ice stalkers materialized above the presentation platform, their white fur pristine and their behavior loops perfectly rendered. They hunted, they killed, they ate, all in safe, pre-recorded dignity that threatened absolutely nobody. Tekessa's analysis covered hunting patterns, caloric requirements, territorial behaviors, and population dynamics. Every fact was meticulously cited. Every conclusion was thoroughly supported. Every minute felt longer than the last. Krelnack made appreciative notes because that was his job, but his secondary brain was already composing the feedback. Comprehensive but lacking engagement with primary source material. Vormak presented next, with the enthusiasm of continental drift. His chosen subject, the plains runners, appeared as holograms that bounded across simulated grasslands in movements calculated from published biomechanical studies. His monotone delivery suggested he found his own research only marginally more interesting than watching erosion occur. The data was solid. The presentation was complete. The entire room radiated an energy best described as waiting for this to end. By the time Jessith flowed to the presentation platform, bioluminescent patterns pulsing in what might have been confidence or indigestion, Krelnak had identified the fundamental problem with this year's cohort. They had all chosen safe subjects, analyzed from safe distances, presented through safe technological intermediaries. Nobody had actually encountered their chosen predators. Nobody had observed them in natural conditions. Nobody had taken any academic risks whatsoever. Jessith's subject was the void swimmers of the deep nebulae, creatures so removed from practical observation that studying them required 3 layers of sensor interpretation. Beautiful, certainly. Deadly in their natural environment, absolutely. But presented as abstract data visualizations that might as well have been theoretical mathematical constructs. "Does anyone," Krelnak interrupted gently after Jessith concluded, "have any primary observational data? Field notes? Direct encounters?" The silence that followed was broken only by the ambient hum of station life support systems. Several students developed sudden intense interests in their datapads. Takessa's antennae drooped further than anatomically seemed possible. "The assignment," he continued, "requested analysis. Analysis implies synthesis of observed phenomena, not merely compilation of existing research. You have all produced literature reviews, not predator studies. More silence. The kind that made students examine their footwear or floor equivalents with scholarly dedication. Well, Krelnak's scales shifted to a pattern expressing disappointed resignation. "We have one presentation remaining. Perhaps our human colleague will surprise us." He checked the chronometer. 2 hours until the final presentation. The human had sent a brief message confirming her attendance and adding only, "Specimen acquired. Arrival imminent." Krelnak dismissed the class for a break, watching as students fled toward the cafeteria with the relief of prisoners granted temporary parole. The morning's presentations had been academically adequate and intellectually numbing. Whatever the human brought this afternoon, at least it might break the monotony. He spent the break reviewing safety protocols he had never needed to use, wondering why he suddenly felt compelled to refresh his memory on emergency containment procedures. Outside the classroom windows, a transport shuttle was requesting docking clearance at an auxiliary port, which was unusual. Most student materials arrived through standard cargo processing. The communication officer's response crackled through station systems. "Auxiliary 12 cleared for biological cargo. Please confirm containment certifications." Biological cargo. Krelnak's primary and secondary brains suddenly achieved perfect agreement. Perhaps he should have read that proposal more carefully. The afternoon session loomed ahead like a storm front on a previously clear horizon, and somewhere in the docking protocols, the word containment was being used with concerning frequency. The human had promised memorable. Krelnak was beginning to suspect he should have clarified what kind of memorable she meant. The afternoon session began with students reassembling in their seats, displaying the particular body language of those who had consumed cafeteria food and now regretted their choices. Krelnak positioned himself at his observation station. Datapad ready, expectations carefully managed at low. Then the door opened. What entered was not a hologram, not a data file, not a carefully edited video compilation with appropriate safety disclaimers. The human walked in carrying 2 living apex predators on her shoulders. They were cubs, admittedly, but that detail seemed irrelevant to the immediate pandemonium that erupted. Takessa's shriek translated into 17 languages simultaneously. Vormak, who had displayed all the emotional range of sedimentary rock for 3 months, suddenly discovered he could move quickly when properly motivated. Jessith's bioluminescence flared through the entire panic spectrum, settling on a shade that meant imminent death accepted. The creatures were feline in basic structure, though that description failed to capture their essential wrongness. Golden fur striped with black, massive paws that promised future lethality, and eyes that tracked movement with the focus of born hunters. They were small now, perhaps 15 kilograms each, but their genes screamed apex predator. in a voice that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to hindbrain survival instincts. "Everyone remain calm," the human said, which was advice approximately 3 seconds too late. She walked to the presentation platform with the casual confidence of someone carrying textbooks, not carnivores. The cubs seemed utterly content, one draped over each shoulder, making sounds that vibrated somewhere between purr and growl. Krelnak's scales had locked into a pattern he didn't recognize, possibly because it was the Throsian equivalent of buffering. His voice, when he found it, emerged higher than normal. "What are those?" "Tigers," she replied, as if this explained everything. "Panthera tigris, Siberian subspecies, apex predators from Earth. I borrowed them from the conservation habitat on Deck 47. Borrowed. She had borrowed apex predators the way one might borrow a stylus. The assignment, Krelnak managed, specified analysis of predator species, not importing live specimens into an academic facility. "You said primary source material was lacking in previous presentations." She gently lifted one cub down, setting it on the platform where it immediately began investigating its surroundings with terrifying curiosity. "I brought primary sources." The second cub joined its sibling, and together they commenced destroying any illusion of academic dignity the room had maintained. One batted at holographic controls with paws that would eventually crack bone. The other discovered Takessa's abandoned datapad and began the ancient predator tradition of knocking objects off surfaces. "Security," Jesseth pulsed weakly. "Someone call security." "Already here." 2 station security officers appeared at the door, saw the situation, and paused in that universal moment of, "This isn't in the manual." The larger one, a Korthan with 4 arms and military posture, spoke carefully. "We received alerts about unauthorized biological transport. Are those Earth tigers?" "Cubs," the human corrected, as if maturity level was the primary concern. 12 weeks old, completely manageable. One cub chose that moment to attempt climbing the presentation equipment, claws extended, making sounds that suggested it found this activity enriching. "Manageable," the security officer repeated flatly. "I have all the proper handling certifications," the human continued, producing a datapad with documentation that was probably legitimate and definitely irrelevant. "And they've been fed, so they're not actually hunting. This is recreational destruction, not predatory behavior." Krelnak's translator struggled with the concept of recreational destruction. The human smiled at her increasingly horrified audience. "So, shall I begin my presentation on human-predator coexistence patterns?" The cubs, delighted by the attention, began wrestling each other with a play-fighting technique that would eventually graduate to killing. The classroom's emergency force fields hummed to standby status, as if sensing their 17-year vacation might be ending. Professor Krelnak had achieved his position through decades of academic rigor, published research, and an unwavering commitment to proper educational protocols. In that moment, watching 2 tiger cubs treat his classroom like a recreational facility while security officers debated containment strategies, he made an executive decision that would either cement his legacy or end his career. "Everyone sit down." The authority in his voice surprised even himself. Students froze mid-panic. Security officers paused their radio consultations. Even the cubs stopped wrestling for approximately 2 seconds before resuming. "This student has brought primary source material. We will observe proper academic procedure and allow her presentation to proceed. Security will remain present. Emergency protocols will stay active, and everyone will learn something today if it kills us." He paused, which it will not, because these are 12-week-old cubs in the care of a certified handler. The human's grin suggested she had been hoping for exactly this response. "Thank you, Professor." She tapped her datapad, and holographic displays materialized above the platform, carefully positioned away from the cub's destructive range. "My presentation concerns a phenomenon unique to Earth, Voluntary predator domestication. Images appeared showing humans throughout history alongside various carnivores. Wolves that became dogs, wildcats that became house cats, creatures that should have been threats, transformed through millennia into companions. Most species, she continued, while one cub attempted to murder her shoelace, maintain appropriate fear responses to apex predators. Humans looked at creatures that could kill us and thought, what if we made friends? Takessa's antennae twitched with confusion, translating roughly to, but why though? The presentation detailed the domestication timeline, but more importantly, it explored the psychology behind it. Humans had taken wolves, animals that hunted in packs and could easily kill individual humans, and turned them into thousands of dog breeds through selective breeding and social bonding. They had convinced small felines to tolerate human presence in exchange for food and shelter, creating a symbiotic relationship that benefited both species. The tigers I brought today, she gestured at the cubs, one of which was now attempting to fit entirely inside a storage compartment, represent the paradox of human-predator relations. We know they're dangerous, we understand their predatory nature, and yet we maintain conservation programs, study them extensively, and some humans dedicate entire lives to their protection. Krelnak found himself taking notes despite the chaos. The academic content was genuinely fascinating, exploring behavioral adaptation, cross-species communication, and the evolutionary advantages of humans' peculiar willingness to coexist with creatures that occupied similar ecological niches. We don't just study predators from a distance, the human explained. We immerse ourselves in their world. We track them, handle them, rehabilitate them. These cubs will eventually return to the wild, but right now, they're helping us understand tiger behavior, health requirements, and population dynamics in ways remote observation never could. One of the security officers had lowered his weapon, now watching the presentation with genuine interest. The other maintained vigilance, but her posture had shifted from imminent threat response to curious observation. The classroom door opened again, and a woman in conservation habitat uniform entered, looking harried. There you are. I turned my back for 5 minutes to process paperwork, and you absconded with my cubs. Borrowed, the human corrected. For educational purposes. This is Dr. Chen, the actual headkeeper. She can verify everything I've said. Dr. Chen surveyed the classroom, the security presence, and her 2 charges, who had discovered that Professor Krelnak's abandoned chair made an excellent climbing structure. Well, they seem untraumatized. I assume the same cannot be said for your classmates? Jessith pulsed something that translated as accurate assessment. The point, the human concluded, retrieving both cubs with practiced efficiency, is that humans don't just analyze predators academically. We engage with them directly, often against all reasonable survival instincts, because we're curious. We want to understand them, protect them, and sometimes, inexplicably, befriend them. She handed one cub to Dr. Chen while maintaining control of the other. Earth's history of predator interaction reveals more about human psychology than about the predators themselves. We're the species that looked at apex carnivores and saw potential companions. We're the ones who thought dangerous and pet weren't mutually exclusive categories. Krelnak's scales had finally settled into something approaching normal academic patterns. And the practical application of this research? Understanding that humans assess risk differently than most species. We don't just calculate threat levels, we calculate relationship possibilities. It's why we have dogs, cats, and conservation programs. It's why I could bring tiger cubs to class and genuinely believe this was a reasonable educational choice. Security escorted Dr. Chen and the cubs back to the habitat, leaving behind a classroom that smelled faintly of predator and strongly of disinfectant that someone had optimistically deployed. The human submitted her presentation file, complete with behavioral data, conservation statistics, and several forms indemnifying the Institute against liability for educational wildlife demonstrations. Krelnak reviewed the material later in the quiet of his office and assigned it the highest grade of the semester. The footnote he added to his academic records was brief. Exemplary primary research. Recommend updating facility policies regarding live specimen presentations. Also recommend cardiac medication for faculty. 3 weeks later, new regulations appeared in the Institute handbook, specifically addressing Earth fauna, and including a comprehensive list of creatures that required pre-approval before educational use. The list was extensive. Tigers appeared in the first subsection, followed by bears, wolves, crocodilians, and a bewildering category labeled Various Australian Wildlife. The humans' presentation became legendary, referenced in academic discussions about field research methodology, and whispered about in student orientations as a cautionary tale about literal interpretation of assignment parameters. And Professor Krelnak never again complained about students lacking primary source material, having learned that sometimes the distance of holographic analysis existed for excellent reasons. Though he kept a photo on his desk, 2 tiger cubs destroying his classroom while a human smiled proudly in the background, the image capturing the exact moment academic theory met Earth's particular brand of practical application. The caption, he added, in his own language, translated roughly to humans. Of course it was humans. Across the Institute, the incident became known simply as the Tiger Presentation. It spawned 3 new safety regulations, 2 academic papers on human risk assessment, and 1 very specific addition to the course syllabus. Live specimens require prior authorization, especially if they possess claws, fangs, venom, or terrestrial origin. The human graduated with honors. The tigers grew into magnificent adults, safely monitored in their conservation habitat, and Professor Krelnak learned what the rest of the galaxy would eventually understand. When humans interpret instructions, always specify what you don't mean, particularly regarding Earth fauna.